Hi, I'm David Barton of WallBuilders, an organization dedicated to presenting America's forgotten history and heroes with an emphasis on our moral, religious, and constitutional heritage. Welcome to the WallBuilders Library and Museum. We have here over 100,000 originals or copies of original documents from before 1812 and thousands from thereafter. This is literally a treasure trove of American history. Proverbs 10:22 tells us that the blessing of the Lord, it maketh rich, and he addeth no sorrow with it. The blessing of the Lord is something that enriches our life, and often some of the greatest blessings we enjoy are things that we seem to notice the least, things we often take for granted. This point was driven home by founding father Benjamin Rush. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a ratifier of the U.S. Constitution, and he was also a dedicated Christian who helped found the Sunday school movement in America and also this organization. This is America's very first Bible Society, and he also helped produce this book. This is America's first mass-produced or stereotyped Bible. Now, he was a prolific author as well, and you see here some of his many original books and writings. And this is his handwritten prayer journal. As he would read through the Scriptures, he would make his own handwritten notes on what he saw in the Scriptures. Now, in his writings, as he acknowledged the many blessings he had received from God for which he was thankful, he stated, quote, "However trifling it may appear, I cannot help adding an acknowledgement of the good providence of God in having preserved me from falls and climbing and descending stairs." Wait a minute. One of the blessings of God that he didn't fall down stairs? Of course that's a blessing. If he'd fallen downstairs, now that wouldn't have been a blessing, but not falling down was a blessing. Now, we notice it when we fall downstairs, but we rarely notice it when we don't fall downstairs. Think how many times you've gone downstairs, not fallen, didn't think about it. You see, not falling downstairs is a genuine blessing. And so it is that some of the simplest things in life, things we take for granted and almost never notice, are some of our biggest blessings. And this is certainly true for those of us who live in America. We are so used to living here that we rarely even notice the blessings that surround us, such as our national stability. You know, America has had only one constitution since 1789, but during that same time, France has had 15 constitutions. Haiti has had 23. Venezuela's had 25. Ecuador has had 20. Thailand has had 17, and on it goes. Political instability characterizes nations across the rest of the world except America. The stability we enjoy in America truly is a blessing. It's the exception and not the rule. So too with our creativity. America has only 4% of the world's population, but every year we produce more inventions and patents and technological discoveries than the rest of the 96% of the world. And our 4% also produces an amazing 25% of the world's gross domestic product, or GDP. We're more creative and we're more prosperous than any other nation in the world, but we barely notice. Now others have noticed. Example, all the way back in 1831, Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville traveled America and he published his findings in this famous book, Democracy in America. Now, based on what he saw, he said, quote, "The position of the Americans is therefore quite exceptional, and it may be believed that no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar one." He also told his readers why it was that America was so exceptional, explaining, quote, "Upon my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention. And the longer I stayed there, the more did I perceive the great political consequences resulting from this state of things. In France, I had almost always seen the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom pursuing courses diametrically opposed to each other. But in America, I found that they were intimately united. There is no country in the whole world in which the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America." But our founding fathers had already affirmed the same religious basis of the nation and its government 60 years earlier when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. They begin that document with 45 words setting forth 3 unique principles on which American government was based and on which it should operate, and these principles were subsequently incorporated into the U.S. Constitution. The first principle declared, all men are created equal and they're endowed by their Creator. The founders thus announced their conviction that there was indeed a divine Creator. Now, this was a political announcement to the entire world, for as the Declaration says, this pronouncement is, quote, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. Now today we're told by judges and others that under the same documents written by our founding fathers, we must be neutral between religion and non-religion. But the Declaration makes clear that this is not true. In this document, which is the first federal call for the nation to openly acknowledge God, President George Washington, right down here, he opens right up here by telling us this. He says, it is the duty, and notice the word duty. They define duty as a legally binding contractual obligation. He said it's the legally binding contractual obligation of all nations. Yes, he said nations, not individuals. He said it's the duty of all nations to do 4 things. Notice the 4 verbs he used. First, to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. Second, to obey His will. Third, to be grateful for His benefits. And fourth, humbly to implore His protection and favor. The father of our country said that acknowledging God was a duty that America and its government owed to God. The second principle in the Declaration acknowledged that, quote, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So not only did the founders attest that there was a Creator, but they also affirmed that the Creator Himself gave specific rights to man, rights that they called inalienable or God-given rights. Now, what are our God-given inalienable rights? Well, the Founding Fathers listed several in the Declaration and many more in the Bill of Rights, including the right to life, to liberty, to property, to self-defense, to freedom of religion, to freedom of conscience, to speech, to assembly, and many others. Now, rights come either from God or from man. And if they come from man, then man has the power to regulate, alter, or even abolish the rights that he gives, and therefore government's power over our lives in the areas where it gives rights becomes absolute and unlimited. But if rights don't come from government but do come from God, then man and his government can be required to recognize and protect those rights that did not come from them. Our founders understood that government would be limited only so long as God was recognized as the source of our rights. The third principle in the Declaration said, quote, that to secure these rights, what rights? Inalienable rights. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So once government recognizes that there is a God and that He gives specific rights to man, it then becomes the duty of government to secure to every individual the exercise of those God-given rights. Thus, government is to protect, rather than infringe and regulate, an individual's right to life, to religious conscience, to self-defense, to religious expressions, and the other inalienable rights. Now, notice that all 3 of these fundamental tenets of our government are all God-centered. History, as well as modern experience, affirms that a secular government will never be a limited government. To the contrary, a secular government will try to micromanage every aspect of a citizen's life. A secular government literally tries to take the place of God. Now, Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of these points in the Declaration, warned us specifically about the dangers of a secularist government. This book is from 1781. This is the first book that Thomas Jefferson ever wrote. His warning found in this book is inscribed in stone inside the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., and it says, quote, and can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are of the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with His wrath. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that His justice cannot sleep forever. Jefferson warns us that the only basis for preserving our national liberties is a conviction in the minds of citizens that our liberties come from God, not government. And that if we begin to mess with those liberties God has given us, then we're going to anger God and the entire nation is going to be in trouble. Now, this is a succinct warning against national secularism. But today, we're told just the opposite. We're told that our founders wanted a secular public square, and that's why they mandated separation of church and state in the First Amendment. But concerning religion, the First Amendment only states, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The only prohibition in this amendment is placed on government, not on individuals or churches. The first part of this amendment is called the Establishment Clause, and the latter part is the Free Exercise Clause, and both clauses were written to ensure that the state would protect, rather than suppress, as it currently does, citizens' inalienable rights of conscience and religious expression. Now, under the modern twisted interpretation of this once clear amendment, a state employee in Minnesota was barred from parking his car in the state parking lot because his car had a religious sticker on the bumper. A library employee in Russellville, Kentucky was barred from wearing her necklace because her necklace had a small cross on it. And college students serving as residential assistants in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, were prohibited from holding Bible studies in their own private dorm rooms. And a school official in St. Louis, Missouri, caught an elementary student praying over his own lunch. He lifted that student from his seat, he reprimanded him in front of the other students, and then he took that student to the principal, who then ordered him to stop praying over his lunch. Now, there's hundreds of more examples, and none have anything to do with Congress making a law. American culture has now become so hostile to Christian citizens publicly practicing their faith that 2 Gideons were arrested in Florida for standing on a sidewalk and giving Bibles to those who wanted them. 4 Christian evangelists at a public festival near Detroit, Michigan were arrested for answering questions they had been asked about their own Christian faith. A Christian father was arrested in Lexington, Massachusetts for objecting to the public school teaching his kindergarten son about homosexuality and gay marriage. A 67-year-old man in Georgia was arrested for passing out Christian tracts on a public street. In Sacramento, California, a youth pastor was arrested after he struck up a casual conversation about faith with fellow shoppers at a mall. Now, hundreds more of these examples are available at www.religiousHostility.org. This is a list compiled by the legal groups who defend and uphold liberty in America. They defend Christians who are arrested and persecuted by the government. These are all direct attacks at the very faith foundation of America. And as Psalms 11:3 pointedly asked, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? Now, this is from 1796. This is George Washington's very last public address, his final address to the American people. And in this, he reminded them of this. He said, quote, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars." Now, according to George Washington, if someone works to undermine religion and morality in public life, then he should not be called a patriot. He should not be called a supporter of his country because it was founded on these very principles. Founding Father Charles Carroll, who's the signer of the Declaration and framer of the Bill of Rights, he similarly declared, quote, "Those who are decrying the Christian religion are undermining the solid foundation of morals, the best security for the duration of free governments." Numerous other founders made similar declarations. They understood the importance of biblical faith to the success of America, and they were so clear on this point that for generations afterwards, our national leaders regularly reminded us of this truth. For example, President Andrew Jackson stated, "The Bible is the rock on which our republic rests." President Zachary Taylor said, "The Bible is indispensable to the safety and permanence of our institutions." And President Teddy Roosevelt reminded Americans, "The teachings of the Bible are so interwoven and so entwined with our whole civic and social life that it would be impossible for us to figure to ourselves what that life would be if these teachings were removed." President Franklin Roosevelt declared, "We cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic." And President Ronald Reagan affirmed, "Of the many influences that have shaped the United States of America into a distinctive nation and people, none may be said to be more fundamental and enduring than the Bible." And there are many other such declarations, but we've forgotten our history. And as a result, we've given away important ground regarding our religious rights. Now, interestingly, from the beginning of America, it was not freedom of religion that was protected, but rather the rights of religious conscience. And the rights of religious conscience is the right to think and to act on our religious beliefs wherever we are. Now, in the 20th century, we narrowed that down to just the freedom of religion. That is the right to act out our religious beliefs. And now, in the 21st century, we've narrowed it even more, reducing it to the right to worship. That is, we have the right to think and act on our religious beliefs as long as it's the privacy of our church or home, but we can't do it in public or in our businesses. We must regain an understanding of the rights of conscience. I mean, after all, this is a subject addressed some 30 or so times in the New Testament, and several verses specifically tell us to craft our public policies to protect the rights of conscience. Now, the Bible-centered colonists who came to America in our earliest years, they understood these Bible teachings, and from the beginning, they provided explicit protection for the rights of conscience, as in the 1640 Document for Providence, the 1649 Maryland Toleration Act, the 1663 Charter for Rhode Island, the 1664 Charter for Jersey, the 1665 Charter for Carolina, the 1676 Governing Document for West Jersey, the 1682 Document for Pennsylvania, the 1701 Document for Delaware, and on it goes. As John Quincy Adams affirmed, quote, "The transcendent and overruling principle of the first settlers of New England was conscience." Significantly, America's first protected, most important, and longest cherished politically protected right was protection for the rights of religious conscience. This remained unchanged during the Revolutionary and Federal eras when the Declaration and the Constitution were written. For example, in talking about the First Amendment, Thomas Jefferson declared, quote, "No provision in our Constitution ought to be dearer to man than that which protects the rights of conscience. Our rulers can have authority over such natural rights only as we have submitted to them. The rights of conscience we never submitted. It is inconsistent with the spirit of our laws and Constitution to force tender consciences." And James Madison pointedly affirmed, quote, "This right of conscience is in its nature an inalienable right. Government is instituted to protect property of every sort, and conscience is the most sacred of all property. It was because we diligently protected the rights of religious conscience that Quakers are not forced to fight in wars. Jehovah's Witnesses are not required to say the Pledge of Allegiance in public schools. The Amish are not required to complete the standard compulsory 12 years of education. Christian Scientists are not forced to have their children vaccinated or undergo medical procedures often required by state laws. Seventh-day Adventists cannot be penalized for refusing to work at their jobs on Saturday. Now, all of this and much else was to protect the rights of religious conscience. But now, following the Supreme Court's homosexual marriage decision, exercising your God-given rights of religious conscience can get you fined, fired, or arrested. The right for Christians to live out their biblical faith is under attack in America. So what can you do to preserve the foundation of the nation, to maintain the God-centered principles that made America great? Well, there are many things you can do, but here are 6. First, protect your church and your ministry by revising your written documents. If you disagree with the radical sexual revolution now being forced on America by the courts, then you must place explicit language into your official documents making this clear. And that includes things like your statement of faith, your religious employment criteria, your family use policies, your membership policies, your marriage policies, whatever. Now, to get more information about how to do this, you can consult your own church attorney, or you can go to the websites of national religious liberty legal organizations such as Liberty Counsel, Liberty Institute, Alliance Defending Freedom, American Center for Law and Justice, and so many others. Now, second, you can speak up. In far too many cases, churches and pulpits have gone silent, wrongly believing that they're required by law to avoid addressing what are often termed political issues. But this is definitely not true. You can go to www.speakupmovement.org, where you will find out from Supreme Court attorneys that legally you are very much unshackled about what you can say and do from the pulpit. Don't voluntarily fetter yourself, but clearly speak out on the important issues confronting society today. In fact, a national survey by pollster George Barton found that the overwhelming majority of Bible-minded churchgoers are hungering for such guidance from the pulpit. For example, an astounding 91% of churchgoers say that it was critically important that they learn the biblical perspective on abortion and its issues, on the beginning of life, on adoption and unwed mothers. 91% say they want to hear that, but only 59% of pastors say they have mentioned that issue, and only 50% of parishioners actually heard them mention the issue. Folks want and need more than just a passing comment on the subject. They need a full biblical perspective on many verses addressing this issue. And 82% of Bible-believing churchgoers felt that it was crucial to hear the biblical view of sexual identity, things like same-sex marriage and transgenderism and LGBT. Now, while 82% want to hear that, 63% of pastors say they've preached about same-sex marriage, but interestingly, only 40% of their parishioners heard them preach about same-sex marriage, which means pastors are not communicating. And when it comes to talking about not just same-sex marriage in general, but about homosexuality in particular, the pulpit has been largely silent on this issue, even though the Bible says much about it. And 80% of churchgoers want to hear about Israel, about its role in the world, about Christian responsibility to Israel, and about U.S. foreign policy toward Israel and its enemies. While that percentage wants to hear it, only 33% of pastors say they have preached about Israel, and only 24% of their parishioners heard them preach about Israel. Now, 79% of churchgoers want to hear about our Christian heritage. They want to hear about the role of Christian faith in American history. They want to hear about the role of the church in America's development. Now, significantly, there were 14 different items where 70% of churchgoers said that they felt it was critically important for them to hear a biblical perspective on those issues from the pulpit. So the second thing you can do is get free and speak out. Christians are begging you to do so. The third thing is to partner with other like-minded organizations, such as One Nation Under God. You can find more information about them at www.oneundergod.com. At their website, you'll learn about Religious Freedom Sunday, and you can also ask the members of your congregation to sign the Declaration of Religious Independence. One Nation Under God will also have information about what your ministry needs to do to protect your rights of conscience and religious freedom. Fourth, plan a voter registration Sunday at your church, or plan several of them. Sadly, some 30 million Christians regularly refuse to vote in presidential elections. They sit on the sidelines. In non-presidential elections, that number swells to even millions more than that, and when it comes to city elections, only 1 in 20 participate. The Bible tells us in Proverbs 14:34 that righteousness exalts a nation, and dozens of verses affirm that a nation's righteousness is determined by its public policies, by how well they conform to God's standards. But how do we get righteous policies? The answer is found in Proverbs 29:2, which declares, "When the righteous rule, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan." Very simply, God-honoring public policies are the result of God-honoring public officials enacting those policies, and in America, the only way there will be God-honoring public officials at any level is if God-honoring citizens elect them. That's our responsibility, and it begins with registering to vote. The fifth thing you can do is vote, and to vote according to biblical values. Every major issue we face today is already addressed in the 613 laws that are delivered in the Bible. Those laws deal with social programs and immigration and helping the poor and taxing and spending and military and education, you name it. But despite that extensive coverage, God made it abundantly clear that some issues are more important to Him than others. In fact, from those 613 laws, God selected His top 10, or what we call the 10 Commandments. Among His top 10 is a prohibition against shedding innocent blood, and that would certainly cover the issue of abortion. He also commands us to keep sex just as He commanded it, within the bounds of marriage between one man and one woman, and that would certainly involve homosexuality and gay marriage. He also tells us that we're to keep our acknowledgments of Him at the foremost, which involves public religious expression and protecting the rights of religious conscience. And then there's issues like Isaiah 126, where God tells us that the righteousness of a land is determined by the judges in that land. And America sure demonstrates the veracity of this scripture, because it's been judges and not legislatures who have imposed on the nation and the states most of the unbiblical policies we now have in place. And that's whether it's abortion on demand or homosexual marriages or prohibitions against the public acknowledgement of God or attacks on the rights of conscience or whatever. Which means that judicial appointments should be a very high concern when we vote. So we must vote, but we must vote according to God's priorities, not our priorities. Sixth, obey 1 Timothy 2:1-4, which tells us to, first of all, pray for our leaders and those in authority. This type of prayer is crucial, and the promise of 2 Chronicles 7:14, and that's the promise that God will heal our land, that promise is rooted in prayer and repentance. But we can't stop here. As John Hancock urged Christians in his day, quote, "I urge you, by all that is dear, by all that is honorable, by all that is sacred, not only that you pray, but that ye act." It's time to awaken ourselves, just as the citizens of ancient Israel did long ago. At that time, recognizing the imminent danger confronting their nation, they concluded that action and involvement was their only reasonable alternative, and as they aptly quipped in 2 Kings 7:3, "Why sit we here till we die?" Indeed. So these are 6 things that you can do to make a difference in our culture right now. And again, you can go to www.oneundergod.com for more information. God bless.